Welcome to Audiobook Heaven.
The Gambler by Fyodor Dostoevsky, translated by C.J. Hogarth. Chapter 13. Almost a month has passed since I last touched these notes which I began under the influence of impressions at once poignant and disordered. The crisis which I then felt to be approaching has now arrived, but in a form 100 times more extensive and unexpected than I had looked for. To me it all seems strange, uncouth, and tragic. Certain occurrences have befallen me which border upon the marvelous. At all events, that is how I view them. I view them so in one regard at least. I refer to the whirlpool of events in which, at the time, I was revolving. But the most curious feature of all is my relation to those events, for hitherto I had never clearly understood myself. Yet now the actual crisis has passed away like a dream. Even my passion for Polina is dead. Was it ever so strong and genuine as I thought? If so, what has become of it now? At times I fancy that I must be mad, that somewhere I am sitting in a madhouse, that these events have merely seemed to happen, that still they merely seem to be happening. I have been arranging and reperusing my notes, perhaps for the purpose of convincing myself that I am not in a madhouse. At present I am lonely and alone. Autumn is coming. Already it is mellowing the leaves, and, as I sit brooding in this melancholy little town, and how melancholy the little towns of Germany can be, I find myself taking no thought for the future, but living under the influence of passing moods, and of my recollections of the tempest which recently drew me into its vortex, and then cast me out again. At times I seem still to be caught within that vortex. At times the tempest seems once more to be gathering, and, as it passes overhead, to be wrapping me in its folds, until I have lost my sense of order and reality, and continue whirling and whirling and whirling around. Yet it may be that I shall be able to stop myself from revolving if once I can succeed in rendering myself an exact account of what has happened within the month just past. Somehow I feel drawn towards the pen. On many and many an evening I have had nothing else in the world to do. But curiously enough, of late I have taken to amusing myself with the works of Monsieur Paul de Kock, which I read in German translations obtained from a wretched local library. These works I cannot abide, yet I read them, and find myself marvelling that I should be doing so. Somehow I seem to be afraid of any serious book, afraid of permitting any serious preoccupation to break the spell of the passing moment. So dear to me is the formless dream of which I have spoken, so dear to me are the impressions which it has left behind it, that I fear to touch the vision with anything new, lest it should dissolve in smoke. But is it so dear to me? Yes, it is dear to me, and will ever be fresh in my recollections, even 40 years hence. So let me write of it, but only partially, and in a more abridged form than my full impressions might warrant. First of all, let me conclude the history of the grandmother. Next day she lost every gulden that she possessed. Things were bound to happen so, for persons of her type who have once entered upon that road descend it with ever-increasing rapidity, even as a sledge descends a toboggan slide. All day until 8 o'clock that evening did she play, and, though I personally did not witness her exploits, I learnt of them later through report. All that day Potapitch remained in attendance upon her, but the Poles who directed her play she changed more than once. As a beginning she dismissed her Pole of the previous day, the Pole whose hair she had pulled, and took to herself another one, but the latter proved worse even than the former, and incurred dismissal in favor of the first Pole, who during the time of his unemployment had nevertheless hovered around the grandmother's chair, and from time to time obtruded his head over her shoulder. At length the old lady became desperate, for the second Pole, when dismissed, imitated his predecessor by declining to go away. with the result that one Pole remained standing on the right of the victim, and the other on her left, from which vantage points the pair quarrelled, abused each other concerning the stakes and rounds, and exchanged the epithet "Ladek" (rascal), and other Polish terms of endearment. Finally, they effected a mutual reconciliation, and, tossing the money about anyhow, played simply at random. Once more quarrelling, each of them staked money on his own side of the Grandmother's chair. For instance, the one Pole staked upon the red, and the other one upon the black, until they had so confused and browbeaten the old lady that, nearly weeping, she was forced to appeal to the head croupier for protection, and to have the two Poles expelled. No time was lost in this being done, despite the rascals' cries and protestations that the old lady was in their debt, that she had cheated them, and that her general behaviour had been mean and dishonourable. The same evening the unfortunate Potapitch related the story to me with tears, complaining that the two men had filled their pockets with money (he himself had seen them do it), which had been shamelessly pilfered from his mistress. For instance, one Pole demanded of the Grandmother 50 gülden for his trouble, and then staked the money by the side of her stake. She happened to win, whereupon he cried out that the winning stake was his, and hers the loser. As soon as the two Poles had been expelled, Potapitch left the room and reported to the authorities that the men's pockets were full of gold, and, on the Grandmother also requesting the head croupier to look into the affair, the police made their appearance, and despite the protests of the Poles, who indeed had been caught red-handed, their pockets were turned inside out, and the contents handed over to the Grandmother. In fact, in view of the circumstance that she lost all day, the croupiers and other authorities of the Casino showed her every attention, and on her fame spreading through the town, visitors of every nationality, even the most knowing of them, the most distinguished, crowded to get a glimpse of la vieille Comtesse Russe, tombée en enfance, who had lost so many millions. Yet with the money which the authorities restored to her from the pockets of the Poles, the Grandmother effected very, very little, for there soon arrived to take his countryman's place a third Pole, a man who could speak Russian fluently, was dressed like a gentleman, albeit in lacqueyish fashion, and sported a huge moustache. Though polite enough to the old lady, he took a high hand with the bystanders. In short, he offered himself less as a servant than as an entertainer. After each round he would turn to the old lady and swear terrible oaths to the effect that he was a Polish gentleman of honour, who would scorn to take a kopeck of her money; and, though he repeated these oaths so often that at length she grew alarmed, he had her play in hand, and began to win on her behalf, wherefore she felt that she could not well get rid of him. An hour later the two Poles, who earlier in the day had been expelled from the Casino, made a reappearance behind the old lady's chair, and renewed their offers of service, even if it were only to be sent on messages. But from Potapitch I subsequently had it that between these rascals and the said gentleman of honour there passed a wink, as well as that the latter put something into their hands. Next, since the Grandmother had not yet lunched, she had scarcely for a moment left her chair, one of the two Poles ran to the restaurant of the Casino, and brought her thence a cup of soup, and afterwards some tea. In fact, both the Poles hastened to perform this office. Finally, towards the close of the day, when it was clear that the Grandmother was about to play her last bank-note, there could be seen standing behind her chair no fewer than 6 natives of Poland, persons who as yet had been neither audible nor visible; and as soon as ever the old lady played the note in question, they took no further notice of her, but pushed their way past her chair to the table, seized the money, and staked it, shouting and disputing the while, and arguing with the gentleman of honour, who also had forgotten the Grandmother's existence, as though he were their equal. Even when the Grandmother had lost her all, and was returning, about 8 o'clock, to the hotel, some 3 or 4 Poles could not bring themselves to leave her, but went on running beside her chair, and volubly protesting that the Grandmother had cheated them, and that she ought to be made to surrender what was not her own. Thus the party arrived at the hotel, whence presently the gang of rascals was ejected neck and crop. According to Potapich's calculations, the grandmother lost, that day, a total of 90,000 roubles, in addition to the money which she had lost the day before. Every paper security which she had brought with her, 5% bonds, internal loan scrip, and what not, she had changed into cash. Also, I could not but marvel at the way in which, for 7 or 8 hours at a stretch, she sat in that chair of hers, almost never leaving the table. Again, Potapitch told me that there were 3 occasions on which she really began to win, but that, led on by false hopes, she was unable to tear herself away at the right moment. Every gambler knows how a person may sit a day and a night at cards without ever casting a glance to right or to left. Meanwhile, that day some other very important events were passing in our hotel. As early as 11 o'clock, that is to say, before the grandmother had quitted her rooms, the General and De Griers decided upon their last stroke. In other words, on learning that the old lady had changed her mind about departing, and was bent on setting out for the Casino again, the whole of our gang, Polina only excepted, proceeded en masse to her rooms, for the purpose of finally and frankly treating with her. But the General, quaking and greatly apprehensive as to his possible future, overdid things. After half an hour's prayers and entreaties, coupled with a full confession of his debts and even of his passion for Mademoiselle Blanche (yes, he had quite lost his head), he suddenly adopted a tone of menace, and started to rage at the old lady, exclaiming that she was sullying the family honour, that she was making a public scandal of herself, and that she was smirching the fair name of Russia. The upshot was that the grandmother turned him out of the room with her stick. It was a real stick, too. Later in the morning he held several consultations with De Griers, the question which occupied him being, "Is it any way possible to make use of the police, to tell them that this respected but unfortunate old lady has gone out of her mind, and is squandering her last kopeck, or something of the kind? In short, is it in any way possible to engineer a species of supervision over, or of restraint upon, the old lady?" De Griers, however, shrugged his shoulders at this, and laughed in the General's face, while the old warrior went on chattering volubly, and running up and down his study. Finally De Griers waved his hand, and disappeared from view, and by evening it became known that he had left the hotel, after holding a very secret and important conference with Mademoiselle Blanche. As for the latter, from early morning she had taken decisive measures, by completely excluding the General from her presence, and bestowing upon him not a glance. Indeed, even when the General pursued her to the Casino, and met her walking arm in arm with the Prince, he, the General, received from her and her mother not the slightest recognition. Nor did the Prince himself bow. The rest of the day Mademoiselle spent in probing the Prince, and trying to make him declare himself. But in this she made a woeful mistake. The little incident occurred in the evening. Suddenly Mademoiselle Blanche realized that the Prince had not even a copper to his name, but, on the contrary, was minded to borrow of her money wherewith to play at roulette. In high displeasure she drove him from her presence, and shut herself up in her room. The same morning I went to see, or rather to look for, Mr. Astley, but was unsuccessful in my quest. Neither in his rooms nor in the Casino nor in the park was he to be found. Nor did he that day lunch at his hotel as usual. However, at about 5 o'clock I caught sight of him walking from the railway station to the Hôtel d'Angleterre. He seemed to be in a great hurry and much preoccupied, though in his face I could discern no actual traces of worry or perturbation. He held out to me a friendly hand with his usual ejaculation of "Ah!" but did not check his stride. I turned and walked beside him, but found, somehow, that his answers forbade any putting of definite questions. Moreover, I felt reluctant to speak to him of Polina, nor, for his part, did he ask me any questions concerning her, although on my telling him of the grandmother's exploits, he listened attentively and gravely, and then shrugged his shoulders. "She is gambling away everything that she has," I remarked. "Indeed! She arrived at the Casino even before I had taken my departure by train, so I knew she had been playing. If I should have time I will go to the Casino to-night and take a look at her. The thing interests me." "Where have you been to-day?" I asked, surprised at myself for having as yet omitted to put to him that question. "To Frankfurt." "On business?" "On business." What more was there to be asked after that? I accompanied him until, as we drew level with the Hôtel des Quatre Saisons, he suddenly nodded to me and disappeared. For myself, I returned home, and came to the conclusion that, even had I met him at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I should have learnt no more from him than I had done at 5 o'clock, for the reason that I had no definite question to ask. It was bound to have been so. For me to formulate the query which I really wished to put was a simple impossibility. Polina spent the whole of that day either in walking about the park with the nurse and children, or in sitting in her own room. For a long while past she had avoided the General and had scarcely had a word to say to him—scarcely a word, I mean, on any serious topic. Yes, that I had noticed. Still, even though I was aware of the position in which the General was placed, it had never occurred to me that he would have any reason to avoid her, or to trouble her with family explanations. Indeed, when I was returning to the hotel, after my conversation with Astley, and chanced to meet Polina and the children, I could see that her face was as calm as though the family disturbances had never touched her. To my salute she responded with a slight bow, and I retired to my room in a very bad humour. Of course, since the affair with the Burmergelms, I had exchanged not a word with Polina, nor had with her any kind of intercourse. Yet I had been at my wits' end, for as time went on there was arising in me an ever-seething dissatisfaction. Even if she did not love me, she ought not to have trampled upon my feelings, nor to have accepted my confessions with such contempt, seeing that she must have been aware that I loved her. Of her own accord she had allowed me to tell her as much. Of course the situation between us had arisen in a curious manner. About 2 months ago I had noticed that she had a desire to make me her friend, her confidant; that she was making trial of me for the purpose, but for some reason or another the desired result had never come about, and we had fallen into the present strange relations which had led me to address her as I had done. At the same time, if my love was distasteful to her, why had she not forbidden me to speak of it to her? But she had not so forbidden me. On the contrary, there had been occasions when she had even invited me to speak. Of course, this might have been done out of sheer wantonness, for I well knew—I had remarked it only too often—that after listening to what I had to say, and angering me almost beyond endurance, she loved suddenly to torture me with some fresh outburst of contempt and aloofness. Yet she must have known that I could not live without her. 3 days had elapsed since the affair with the Baron, and I could bear the severance no longer. When that afternoon I met her near the Casino, my heart almost made me faint, it beat so violently. She too could not live without me, for had she not said that she had need of me? Or had that too been spoken in jest? That she had a secret of some kind there could be no doubt. What she had said to the Grandmother had stabbed me to the heart. On 1,000 occasions I had challenged her to be open with me, nor could she have been ignorant that I was ready to give my very life for her. Yet always she had kept me at a distance with that contemptuous air of hers, or else she had demanded of me, in lieu of the life which I offered to lay at her feet, such escapades as I had perpetrated with the Baron. Ah! Was it not torture to me, all this? For could it be that her whole world was bound up with the Frenchman? What, too, about Mr. Astley? The affair was inexplicable throughout. My God, what distress it caused me! Arrived home, I, in a fit of frenzy, indited the following: Polina Alexandrovna, I can see that there is approaching us an exposure which will involve you too. For the last time I ask of you, have you, or have you not, any need of my life? If you have, then make such dispositions as you wish, and I shall always be discoverable in my room if required. If you have need of my life, write or send for me. I sealed the letter, and dispatched it by the hand of a corridor lackey, with orders to hand it to the addressee in person. Though I expected no answer, scarcely 3 minutes had elapsed before the lackey returned with the compliments of a certain person. Next, about 7 o'clock, I was sent for by the General. I found him in his study, apparently preparing to go out again, for his hat and stick were lying on the sofa. When I entered he was standing in the middle of the room, his feet wide apart, and his head bent down. Also he appeared to be talking to himself. But as soon as ever he saw me at the door he came towards me in such a curious manner that involuntarily I retreated a step and was for leaving the room. Whereupon he seized me by both hands, and drawing me towards the sofa, and seating himself thereon, he forced me to sit down on a chair opposite him. Then, without letting go of my hands, he exclaimed with quivering lips and a sparkle of tears on his eyelashes, "Oh, Alexei Ivanovich, save me! Save me! Have some mercy upon me!" For a long time I could not make out what he meant, although he kept talking and talking, and constantly repeating to himself, "Have mercy! Mercy!" At length, however, I divined that he was expecting me to give him something in the nature of advice, or rather that, deserted by every one, and overwhelmed with grief and apprehension, he had bethought himself of my existence, and sent for me to relieve his feelings by talking and talking and talking. In fact, he was in such a confused and despondent state of mind that, clasping his hands together, he actually went down upon his knees and begged me to go to Mlle. Blanche, and beseech and advise her to return to him, and to accept him in marriage. "But, General," I exclaimed, "possibly Mlle. Blanche has scarcely even remarked my existence. What could I do with her?" It was in vain that I protested, for he could understand nothing that was said to him. Next he started talking about the grandmother, but always in a disconnected sort of fashion, his one thought being to send for the police. "In Russia," he said, suddenly boiling over with indignation, "or in any well-ordered state where there exists a government, old women like my mother are placed under proper guardianship. Yes, my good sir," he went on, relapsing into a scolding tone as he leapt to his feet and started to pace the room. "Do you not know this?" He seemed to be addressing some imaginary auditor in the corner. "Do you not know this, that in Russia old women like her are subjected to restraint, the devil take them?" Again he threw himself down upon the sofa. A minute later, though sobbing and almost breathless, he managed to gasp out that Mlle. Blanche had refused to marry him, for the reason that the grandmother had turned up in place of a telegram, and it was therefore clear that he had no inheritance to look for. Evidently he supposed that I had hitherto been in entire ignorance of all this. Again, when I referred to De Griers, the General made a gesture of despair. "He has gone away," he said, "and everything which I possess is mortgaged to him. I stand stripped to my skin. Even of the money which you brought me from Paris, I know not if 700 francs be left. Of course that sum will do to go on with, but as regards the future, I know nothing. I know nothing." "Then how will you pay your hotel bill?" I cried in consternation, "and what shall you do afterwards?" He looked at me vaguely, but it was clear that he had not understood, perhaps had not even heard, my questions. Then I tried to get him to speak of Polina and the children, but he only returned brief answers of "yes, yes," and again started to maunder about the Prince and the likelihood of the latter marrying Mlle. Blanche. "What on earth am I to do?" he concluded. "What on earth am I to do? Is this not ingratitude? Is it not sheer ingratitude?" And he burst into tears. Nothing could be done with such a man. Yet to leave him alone was dangerous, for something might happen to him. I withdrew from his rooms for a little while, but warned the nursemaid to keep an eye upon him, as well as exchanged a word with the corridor lackey, a very talkative fellow, who likewise promised to remain on the lookout. Hardly had I left the General when Potapitch approached me with a summons from the grandmother. It was now 8 o'clock, and she had returned from the Casino after finally losing all that she possessed. I found her sitting in her chair, much distressed and evidently fatigued. Presently Martha brought her a cup of tea and forced her to drink it. Yet, even then I could detect in the old lady's tone and manner a great change. "Good evening, Alexei Ivanovich," she said slowly, with her head drooping. "Pardon me for disturbing you again. Yes, you must pardon an old woman like myself. For I have left behind me all that I possess, nearly 100,000 roubles. You did quite right in declining to come with me this evening. Now I am without money, without a single groat.
But I must not delay a moment. I must leave by the 9:30 train. I have sent for that English friend of yours, and am going to beg of him 3,000 francs for a week. Please try and persuade him to think nothing of it, nor yet to refuse me, for I am still a rich woman who possesses 3 villages and a couple of mansions. Yes, the money shall be found, for I have not yet squandered everything. I tell you this in order that he may have no doubts about— Ah, but here he is. Clearly he is a good fellow." True enough, Astley had come hot-foot on receiving the grandmother's appeal. Scarcely stopping even to reflect, and with scarcely a word, he counted out the 3,000 francs under a note of hand which she duly signed. Then, his business done, he bowed, and lost no time in taking his departure. "You too leave me, Alexei Ivanovich," said the grandmother. "All my bones are aching, and I still have an hour in which to rest. Do not be hard upon me, old fool that I am. Never again shall I blame young people for being frivolous. I should think it wrong even to blame that unhappy general of yours. Nevertheless, I do not mean to let him have any of my money, which is all that he desires, for the reason that I look upon him as a perfect blockhead, and consider myself, simpleton though I be, at least wiser than he is. How surely does God visit old age, and punish it for its presumption! Well, good-bye. Martha, come and lift me up." However, I had a mind to see the old lady off, and moreover I was in an expectant frame of mind. Somehow I kept thinking that something was going to happen. Wherefore I could not rest quietly in my room, but stepped out into the corridor, and then into the Chestnut Avenue for a few minutes' stroll. My letter to Polina had been clear and firm, and in the present crisis, I felt sure, would prove final. I had heard of De Griers' departure, and however much Polina might reject me as a friend, she might not reject me altogether as a servant. She would need me to fetch and carry for her, and I was ready to do so. How could it have been otherwise? Towards the hour of the train's departure I hastened to the station, and put the grandmother into her compartment, she and her party occupying a reserved family saloon. "Thanks for your disinterested assistance," she said at parting. "Oh, and please remind Prascovia of what I said to her last night. I expect soon to see her." Then I returned home. As I was passing the door of the General's suite, I met the nursemaid, and inquired after her master. "There is nothing new to report, sir," she replied quietly. Nevertheless I decided to enter, and was just doing so, when I halted thunderstruck on the threshold, for before me I beheld the General and Mlle. Blanche laughing gaily at one another, while beside them on the sofa there was seated her mother. Clearly the General was almost out of his mind with joy, for he was talking all sorts of nonsense, and bubbling over with a long-drawn, nervous laugh—a laugh which twisted his face into innumerable wrinkles, and caused his eyes almost to disappear. Afterwards I learnt from Mlle. Blanche herself that, after dismissing the Prince and hearing of the General's tears, she bethought her of going to comfort the old man, and had just arrived for the purpose when I entered. Fortunately, the poor General did not know that his fate had been decided, that Mademoiselle had long ago packed her trunks in readiness for the first morning train to Paris. Hesitating a moment on the threshold, I changed my mind as to entering, and departed unnoticed. Ascending to my room, and opening the door, I perceived in the semi-darkness a figure seated on a chair in the corner by the window. The figure did not rise when I entered, so I approached it swiftly, peered at it closely, and felt my heart almost stop beating. The figure was Polina. Chapter 13.